The cafe was unusually crowded for a Tuesday morning. Aiden didn't mind it though, he liked the energy. There was something oddly reassuring about the chaos of people bustling around, the soft hum of conversation blending with the hiss of the espresso machine. He had no idea why, but it made him feel like he belonged to something bigger, something that wasn't just him and his troublesome antimatter powers. Americano, please, Aiden said with a warm smile, sliding his card across the counter. The barista, a young woman with bright pink hair and a tattoo of a cat on her arm, took his card with a bored expression. She didn't seem interested in the fact that the man standing in front of her was practically a walking disaster waiting to happen. Aiden, for all his superpowers, had a terrible habit of tripping over his own feet and causing small explosions when his emotions got the better of him. Name for the order? She asked, barely looking up. Aiden, he replied, too quickly. She paused for a second, her eyes narrowing. Aiden, like the guy who? No, not that Aiden, he interrupted, his voice cracking. Not even close. She raised an eyebrow. Right. Sure. Aiden. Got it. He smiled awkwardly and stepped aside, glancing around the cafe, hoping that the universe wouldn't decide to cause trouble today. It was one of those rare moments where Aiden felt normal, and he wasn't about to let his volatile abilities ruin that. He stared at his phone, scrolling through the usual news feed. Something about a new tech company claiming they could make anti-gravity shoes. He snorted. Right, he muttered to himself. Anti-gravity shoes. Sure. You know, I have powers that could make gravity look like child's play, but whatever. As he tapped the screen idly, his phone vibrated, and a text from his old friend Lila popped up. Lila, Aiden, you better get ready. It's coming. Aiden paused, his finger hovering over the screen. He knew what she meant. But he didn't want to think about it. Not today. Not while he was finally enjoying a calm moment. He pushed the thought aside, quickly typing back a simple, Aiden, all good. Just grabbing coffee. Before he could even finish his message, a loud crash echoed from the far end of the cafe. Aiden's body tensed, instinctively ready to react. It was like his senses were on a hair trigger at all times, waiting for the smallest disturbance to set him off. He quickly scanned the room, trying to determine the source of the noise. A couple of chairs had fallen over, and a man was on the ground, clutching his chest and gasping for air. People were shouting, but Aiden couldn't hear the words. It wasn't until he saw the suspicious glint in the man's eyes that he knew something was very wrong. Not again, Aiden muttered under his breath, realizing that the only explanation was that he had triggered it. His anxiety had once again gotten the better of him, and now it was spilling into the world around him. Before Aiden could take a step forward to investigate, the coffee barista yelled, "Watch out," as the man suddenly exploded. Not literally, at least, not in the way Aiden's powers worked, but there was a violent, unnatural shift in the atmosphere around the man. It felt like a pressure wave, and the air crackled with dangerous energy. The man, writhing in pain, seemed to shimmer for a moment before disappearing into thin air, leaving only a faint trail of blue light in his wake. For a split second, everything was still. Aiden stood frozen in place, heart pounding in his chest. It took him a moment to realize that the man was gone, completely erased. There were no traces of him left, not even a scorch mark. A soft voice pulled him back to reality. "Aiden, we need to leave. Now." Lila was standing at the door, motioning urgently for him to follow. There was no time to ask questions. He knew that if Lila was here, things had escalated beyond anything he could handle alone. He nodded and rushed toward her, dodging debris as the rest of the cafe patrons screamed and ran for the exits. Once outside, he found Lila waiting by a sleek black car, her face grim. "We need to talk," she said, pulling him into the car and slamming the door behind them. As the engine roared to life, Aiden turned to her, eyes wide. What just happened? Was that some kind of cloning experiment gone wrong? Lila looked at him, her face softening for a moment. "I'm sorry, Aiden." But you were right. It's him. Caleb. The mention of Caleb sent a chill down his spine. Caleb had once been a colleague, a scientist, and a friend. But somewhere along the way, their paths had split. Caleb had always been obsessed with Aiden's antimatter abilities, believing they could be harnessed for something far greater, something that could change the world. Aiden had tried to avoid thinking about it. But now, everything seemed to be falling into place. Lila's voice broke through his thoughts. Caleb has found a way to clone you. Not just any clone, one that can replicate your powers. And worse, he's using them to make a weapon. One that could destroy entire cities if left unchecked. Aiden felt the blood drain from his face. He didn't want to believe it, but the pieces were starting to fall into place. The clone he just faced, the one who had disappeared, had been a reflection of himself. But if he has a clone of me, why not just, Aiden started, but Lila interrupted him. He can't just clone you, Aiden, she said, her voice cold and calculating. It's more complicated than that. The clone needs to be perfect, it has to replicate every part of you, your genes, your mind, everything. That's what Caleb's after. He's trying to make an army of clones, each one more powerful than the last. Aiden felt sick. So, what now? I just fight myself until there's nothing left? Lila shook her head. We need to find Caleb. Destroy the lab before it's too late. If we don't, he'll be unstoppable. Aiden nodded, determination flashing in his eyes. There was no time for hesitation. Caleb had gone too far. Aiden was the only one who could stop him. Lila's car sped through the streets, weaving in and out of traffic. The faint glow of neon signs from nearby bars and restaurants flickered past them, and Aiden's mind raced. Caleb had taken things too far this time. An army of clones, each with the potential to destroy entire cities, was a nightmare. Aiden's own clone, the one he just faced, had been terrifying, and that wasn't even the worst of it. If Caleb had perfected the process, if his clones could replicate Aiden's powers, then what chance did anyone have? He clenched his fists, fingers digging into his palms as the car made a sharp turn onto a quieter street. The sun was beginning to set, casting an eerie orange hue across the city skyline, but the city felt wrong, as if it were holding its breath. Aiden's stomach twisted. He could almost feel the weight of what was coming. The car screeched to a halt in front of an old, industrial-looking building. It was the last place Aiden wanted to be. This wasn't just some warehouse or research lab, it was Caleb's private facility, the one they had once worked in together before Aiden had disappeared from the science scene. It was where they had tested the boundaries of Aiden's powers, before Caleb's obsession had turned into madness. Lila's voice cut through his thoughts. We're here. Stay focused. This won't be easy. Aiden nodded, pulling himself out of the car. He didn't feel easy, not at all. His mind was in turmoil, spinning with questions and doubts. He could feel the deep weight of his own responsibility pressing on him, but now wasn't the time to question his actions. He had to end this, he had to stop Caleb and his clones before it was too late. They approached the building, its dark windows reflecting the dying light of the day. Aiden tried to push aside the unsettling memories of the place. This was where Caleb had tried to push his limits, and where Aiden's abilities had first manifested in full force. The moment his powers had broken through, it had changed everything. Aiden had known then that the world wasn't ready for someone like him. A soft beep came from Lila's wrist communicator, pulling Aiden back to the present. She glanced down at it, then at him. We're not alone. They know we're here. Aiden's heart skipped a beat. They. The clones that he could already feel the familiar, unsettling pull of his own powers, the static, the crackling sensation at the edge of his mind. He knew they were coming. There was no point in running now. Lila motioned for him to follow her. Let's move quickly. They snuck through a side door, the cool metal of the building giving off an unsettling echo as they stepped inside. The hallway stretched out before them, dimly lit by flickering fluorescent lights. The air smelled faintly of oil and concrete, the sterile scent of ALAB.as. They moved further inside. Aiden felt a ripple in the air, a subtle shift that sent his nerves on edge. The clones were close, and with every step he took, the tension in the air thickened. It was as if the building itself had a heartbeat. "There's a security system," Lila murmured, pointing to a small control panel on the wall. "I can override it, but it'll take a minute." Aiden stood guard, his eyes scanning the shadows. He could feel the energy of the place, the low hum that seemed to pulse from all around them. There was no doubt now. Caleb had been working here, not just on the clones but on something worse. He had unlocked something in the human genome, something that Aiden had never fully understood but feared nonetheless. The sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway behind them, and Aiden tensed. He didn't need to see who it was to know. His clone, the one he'd fought earlier, was closing in. "You ready?" Aiden whispered. Lila nodded, tapping a few buttons on the control panel. "Just keep them distracted." Aiden's heart pounded as he stepped forward, taking his position at the far end of the hall. He wasn't sure what was worse, the fear of facing himself or the reality that this clone might be even stronger than he was. It wasn't long before the first clone appeared. Aiden didn't need to see the figure's face to know it was him. It was an eerie reflection of himself, his movements a little too precise, his posture just slightly off. The clone had the same features, the same height, the same build, but there was no humanity in the eyes. No warmth. Just cold, calculated menace. The clone's lips curled into a smile, an unsettling, twisted version of Aiden's own grin. Well, Aiden. You should have stayed out of this." Aiden stood tall, forcing himself to keep his voice steady. "I won't let you destroy everything." The clone laughed, a hollow sound. "Destroy? No. I'm just fulfilling my purpose. Caleb's purpose. And you, Aiden, are the perfect tool for that." Before Aiden could respond, the clone raised his hand, and a pulse of antimatter energy shot toward him. Aiden's heart skipped a beat as the blast tore through the hallway, sending debris flying. He barely had time to react, throwing up a shield of his own energy just in time to block the blast. The force of it pushed him back, and his feet slid across the concrete floor. The clone stepped forward, its movements fluid and calculated. "You think you can stop me? You're just a pale imitation of the real thing." Aiden gritted his teeth, summoning every ounce of strength he had to regain his balance. The clone wasn't just a mirror image, it was a weapon. And Aiden was going to have to fight himself, quite literally, to the death. As the clone attacked again, Aiden's mind raced. He couldn't just rely on brute force. He needed to be smarter. He needed to outthink this version of himself. Aiden's powers were volatile, unpredictable, even for him, but that also meant they were dangerous. The longer they fought, the more likely they were to destroy the entire building, and Caleb was waiting for that to happen. Aiden's clone lunged at him again, but this time Aiden was ready. With a sharp move, he redirected the blast, sending it ricocheting off the walls, creating a shockwave that knocked both of them off balance. For a moment, everything was quiet, then the clone spoke again, his voice low and mocking. "You're weak. You always have been." Aiden clenched his fists, the energy swirling in his palms. He could feel the pull of destruction in his very bones. "I've learned to control it," he said through gritted teeth. "And now it's time to stop you." Without warning, Aiden launched himself at the clone, a burst of antimatter erupting from his hands. The two forces collided in a violent explosion, the shockwave shaking the building to its core. Dust and debris filled the air, and Aiden was thrown back, crashing into the metal wall. He was dizzy, disoriented, but as he regained his footing, he saw the clone still standing, unscathed, a wicked smile playing across its face. "You can't stop me," the clone said. "You are me. And I am you." The realization hit Aiden like a ton of bricks. The clone wasn't just a mirror, it was a part of him, a twisted version, but still a reflection of the person he had become. Before he could make his next move, the room was plunged into darkness, and a voice echoed from the shadows, "Enough." The darkness that enveloped the hallway was suffocating. The only sound was the deep hum of the building's failing lights and the distant echoes of Aiden's labored breath. His senses were heightened, and every fiber of his being screamed for him to act. Caleb's voice, cold and menacing, reverberated off the walls. "Enough," the voice repeated, each word thick with power and finality. Aiden's pulse quickened as he pushed himself to his feet. The clone stood motionless across from him, its posture stiff and unmoving. There was no way to know where Caleb was hiding in the shadows, but Aiden could feel the scientist's presence like a weight pressing against his chest. "Aiden." The voice came again, closer this time, sharp like a blade. Aiden's blood ran cold, and he clenched his fists, readying himself. He knew what this meant. Caleb was here, in the flesh, no longer hiding behind the veil of his clones. "I've been waiting for this moment," Caleb's voice echoed once more. "You don't understand what you're dealing with." Aiden's mind spun as he tried to gather his bearings. The clone had taken a step back, as though awaiting some cue, while the shadows seemed to pulse with an ominous energy, almost alive. The static in the air was unbearable, the same sensation that Aiden had felt when the first clone attacked. Only now, it felt like the entire building was charging with energy, the power waiting to explode. "I understand perfectly, Caleb," Aiden said, his voice steady but filled with barely contained rage. "I understand that you've taken something I've worked my whole life to control and twisted it into a weapon. You've cloned me, manipulated my abilities to create a monster. You've made me the enemy of the world." Caleb stepped out from the shadows, a figure both familiar and alien. His face was gaunt, eyes wild with obsession, his hair tangled and unkempt. He looked almost more machine than man, as if the years of experimentation had hollowed him out. His eyes gleamed in the dim light as he looked at Aiden. "No, Aiden. You misunderstand. I've created the future. The clones, your clones, are the next step in evolution. They will become the perfect beings, beings who will shape the world in a way you never could." Caleb's voice was slow, deliberate, as though he were explaining the simple truth of the universe. "Your power, your instability, your potential, they all belong to me now." Aiden swallowed his rising fury, trying to keep his focus. The air was electric, crackling with energy. His body was tense, every muscle locked, ready for the fight. His clone took a step forward, matching his stance, mimicking every movement with unsettling precision. "You're not the future, Caleb. You're a madman, a destroyer." Aiden spat, his voice laced with venom. For a moment, there was only silence. Caleb stared at Aiden as though the words hadn't even registered, and then, a smile slowly curled on his lips. "You still don't get it, do you?" "It's not about destruction," Caleb said, his voice dripping with cold confidence. "It's about control. About mastery. I'll take everything you are, everything you've ever been, and make it better." Aiden's body stiffened. He had to end this. He couldn't let Caleb win. This was the moment. With a surge of energy, Aiden threw himself at the clone, his hands crackling with antimatter as he slammed them forward, aiming directly for his counterpart. The clone didn't move, didn't flinch. It was too perfect, too fast, too in sync with Aiden's every move. A blinding pulse of energy exploded between them, sending shockwaves through the building. The walls trembled as the air itself seemed to fold in on itself. Aiden struggled to maintain control, his powers surging beyond his grasp, his every instinct telling him to destroy, to burn it all. But then, something shifted, an odd feeling, like the pull of gravity had reversed, or time itself had bent. His power was being mirrored, fought against by its perfect reflection. For the first time in his life, Aiden felt weak. The clone's body absorbed the force of his attack effortlessly, shifting its stance like a dancer, fluid, controlled. Aiden recoiled, only for the clone to step forward again, matching his every move as though it were one step ahead, reading his mind. Aiden was trapped in the cycle of his own design. His powers were beyond his control, and every action he took was reflected back at him with equal force. The clone didn't hesitate. It was him at his worst, at his most destructive. Caleb watched with a mixture of pride and anticipation, his cold eyes following the battle with unsettling focus. You see, Aiden? You're not just fighting me. You're fighting yourself. The words hit harder than any punch. The clone raised its hand, and Aiden braced himself for the inevitable blast of energy. But before it could hit, someone, intervened. Lila, she appeared from the shadows, a small device clutched in her hands. She flicked a switch, and a pulse of white light shot through the room, creating a barrier of energy that interrupted the clone's attack. The clone staggered back, momentarily disoriented. Aiden, get out of there. Lila shouted, her voice strained with urgency. Aiden didn't hesitate. He surged forward, grabbing the collar of his clone's jacket and pulling him into a headlock. He could feel the same energy flowing through them both, the crackling hum of antimatter. The clone grunted in frustration but didn't fight back. It knew that every move it made was countered before it could even complete the action. It was time. With a grunt of effort, Aiden slammed the clone into the ground, his fist landing on the concrete with a burst of energy that fractured the floor beneath them. For a brief moment, the room was still. Then, without warning, the clone exploded upward, throwing Aiden off as it launched a shockwave of energy into the air. The force sent Aiden sprawling backward, his body slamming against the metal wall. He was hurt, disoriented, but he wasn't finished. Aiden's chest heaved as he took a few deep breaths, pushing himself back to his feet. His mind was clear now. The clone wasn't just a reflection, it was an adversary, a threat. But more importantly, it was proof that he could do this. Caleb's voice cut through the room again, filled with rage. You really think you can stop this? You're nothing more than a glorified science experiment, Aiden. And now you're out of time. Aiden turned to face Caleb, the weight of his powers heavy in his chest. I don't have to stop this alone, he said. He didn't need to, he had something Caleb didn't, the ability to change, to grow. His powers might be unpredictable, but they weren't just a weapon, they were his responsibility. He didn't have to fight for control anymore. He had to fight for the future. The final showdown came without warning. Aiden pushed forward, using his powers not as a weapon, but as a shield. The blast from his clone met his energy field, the force of their combined power creating a barrier that shook the building to its foundations. The antimatter energy collided in a violent crescendo, but this time, Aiden held his ground. The pulse of destruction reverberated through the lab, but it was his will that contained it. In a flash, the explosion was gone, leaving only a ruined room and the sounds of silence. The clone lay motionless on the ground, and Caleb stood frozen, his face a mask of disbelief. Aiden's chest was still rising and falling with exertion, but the fight was over. Caleb didn't speak again. There was nothing left to say, the world was safe, for now.